Hi. The Old Testament was the Bible of the first Christians, including those who wrote the New Testament. And as such, they referenced it frequently as an authority for their belief in Jesus as Israel's Messiah. Sometimes they did that by actually quoting the Old Testament. These are most easily seen in quotation formulae. This happened so that the scriptures might be fulfilled that says, for example. At other times, however, Old Testament stories are not quoted but merely echoed in the New Testament without the actual words of the story ever being used. And yet it is assumed that the reader or hearer will know what the writer is talking about. Let me give you a modern parallel. My brother's dog was barking loudly one day and he quipped, "Timmy must be in the well." Now, I knew instantly what he was talking about. You see, people of a certain age will remember television in its infancy, and one favorite TV show was Lassie, a collie whose owner was a little boy named Timmy. Every week, it seemed, Timmy would get into trouble and Lassie would have to save the day, the paradigm for which was Timmy's falling into the well, and Lassie running around and barking loudly until Timmy's mom and uncle would find Lassie and follow Lassie to the well where they would rescue Timmy. And so all my brother had to say was, "Timmy's in the well," and I filled in the rest of the story. That's an echo of Scripture as opposed to a quotation of Scripture. In the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 43 to 51, the Old Testament Jacob story is echoed in order to provide the reader with an interpretive framework for understanding Nathaniel, the writer assuming his readers know their Old Testament well enough to fill in the details without his actually having to quote it. John narrates the call of the first disciples in chapter 1 by pointing out that at least two of Jesus' disciples were formerly disciples of John the Baptist. One of them, Andrew, was the brother of Simon Peter. And it was he who convinced Peter that Jesus was, in fact, Israel's long-awaited Messiah. John then picks up the story around the Sea of Galilee where Jesus is preaching, and where two more followers join the ranks of the disciples, Philip and Nathaniel. Philip was already acquainted with Peter and Andrew because he was from their hometown, Bethsaida. Philip told Nathaniel about Jesus, and at first Nathaniel was skeptical because Jesus was from Nazareth, a small town not associated with current messianic speculation. But he investigates anyway, and Jesus, seeing him approaching, says of him, "Behold a true Israelite in whom there is no guile." Nathanael asks Jesus, "How is it that you know me?" And Jesus says, "Before Philip called you, and you were under the sycamore tree," the Greek word for fig tree is sika, from which we get our English word sycamore, "I saw you." Now, impressed, Nathanael said, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel," confessing Jesus as Israel's Messiah. Jesus replies, "You were impressed that I saw you even before you came to me? You'll see greater things than this. You will see the heavens opened and angels ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." Now, even though Genesis and the Jacob story are never quoted, they are twice echoed in this story, in the comment about Nathanael being guileless, and in the comment about the angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. You see, John assumes that his audience, including you, knows their Old Testament well enough to make the connection and to fill in the details of the story. But modern readers of John's Gospel, not knowing their Old Testament as well as John's original readers and audience would have, often miss the echoes and thereby miss John's point. For example, Jesus calls Nathanael a true Israelite in whom there is no guile, an allusion to and contrast with Jacob, the proverbial untrustworthy trickster of Genesis, who was anything but guileless and a true Israelite, even though he would later have his name changed from Jacob to Israel in Genesis 35:10. And again, in Genesis 28, Jacob names the place where he wrestled with God Bethel, Hebrew for house of God. In Israel's subsequent history, Bethel becomes a sacred shrine where Yahweh is worshipped, arguably the most important place where God and man meet, until David founds Jerusalem and builds the temple as the new Bethel, the house of God. That is to say, Bethel is the place where God and man meet. In the story in Genesis, that's underlined by the fact that angels ascend and descend from heaven on the ladder at Bethel. Now, John is clearly echoing the Jacob story in this description of Nathaniel, making the point that Nathaniel was a Jacob character who, unlike the original Jacob, got it right. Now, it is widely recognized among New Testament scholars that John's gospel offers something of a critique of the Judaism that rejected Jesus as Messiah. Note how he emphasizes Jesus as the replacement of the various Jewish festivals and feasts, the point apparently being that when that to which the feasts points arrives, why do we need to celebrate anticipatory feasts anymore? In the person of Nathaniel, John has a foil for the Judaism that, when encountering the Messiah, failed to recognize him as such. Much like Jacob in the Genesis story wrestled with God, or an angel of God, at Bethel, the house of God, and did not recognize him as God. Note how Genesis says, God was in this place, Bethel, and I did not know it. In the Nathaniel story, John seems intentionally to portray Nathaniel as a guileless Jacob, who, unlike his Old Testament counterpart, recognized Jesus as the new Bethel, the place where God and man meet. Only this time, the place is not a shrine or a temple, but a person. As a sidebar, there is a persistent tradition that Nathaniel was another name for James, son of Alphaeus. However, in the Greek, there are no Jameses in the New Testament, James being an Anglo-Saxon name that was not in use in biblical times. Rather, everyone in your English Bible who is named James is actually, in the original Greek, Jacob, Yakovos, leading some scholars to argue that the Nathaniel-Jacob comparison in the story adds further support to the identification of Nathaniel as James or Jacob, son of Alphaeus. In this respect, Jacob's words in Genesis 28 are both telling and provocative. God was in this place and I did not know it. That's the whole point of John's story about Jesus. God was in this place, actually in this person, and Israel didn't know it. He came unto his own, but his own received him not, John says in his prologue to the gospel. Nathaniel, on the other hand, unlike Jacob of old, did know it when Jesus came. Hence, Nathaniel represents faithful and believing Israel, who, when confronted with the new Bethel, the new house of God, acknowledged him as Messiah and believed in him. Well, for those of you doing your biographical study on Nathaniel, I hope this brief exposition of John 1 helps you to understand the subtle use John makes of Old Testament echoes of the Jacob story in his description of Nathaniel. Until next time, take care. God bless.